Okay, hey, welcome everybody. Welcome to our first meeting. We will likely do several of these meetings tonight, or several of these meetings, but tonight's meeting, we're gonna focus on the overview of the program. And Scott Bailey, who you all saw, 110 of you for the movement screens, is going to talk about some of the findings from all of the athletes and kind of give an overview of that data. And we've already made some changes to our program based on what Scott has been able to share. So anyway, thank you for joining us tonight. I did share in an email a quick agenda, and I'll put that up on the screen here once I get to my part. But we're going to cover the movement screens and how important those are, and how we want to continue to do those corrective exercises, and specifically what corrective exercises. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the program, including the manual. And so hopefully this is really valuable for you, and hopefully it helps kind of better helps you with the program and kind of do more quicker with the program. So but before I get started and turn it over to Scott, I just want to thank everybody for number one, being here. Two, I just want to thank everybody that's a part of this on my staff, including Scott, who's my brother-in-law. I don't know if you knew that. He might have shared that, but Scott and I started talking a few years ago about the movement screens and how we can better get a better picture of all of our athletes in the VIP program. And so those conversations led to the movement screen and the throwing analysis that we did with all those athletes, all of our athletes prior to starting. And honestly, it's been so valuable to go through that process. So Scott has been amazing in terms of giving information that just most athletes are not getting. Luckily, and maybe in college they get it if they're lucky.
Yeah.
And so in addition to that, you guys have been able to meet the throwing trainers and our strength trainers, and I could not be luckier to have such a great group of coaches and trainers and physical therapists that get to work with all the athletes. So I'm just very fortunate, and I think the athletes win because of that. So I just want to throw that out there. So anyway, Scott, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen,
okay.
And we'll go a little education. I have my notebook, you guys. So athletes and parents, if you have a notebook and some things to write down, I definitely recommend doing that. And we'll go ahead and get started. So Scott, it's all you.
Thank you.
Go ahead and pull this up. And okay. Are you good?
Yeah, go back to the beginning, the start.
There we go.
Okay. So hello, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good evening. I just wanted to go over the movement screen process and the different measurements I took and why they're important, and some sports medicine research to back up everything that was done as far as my end was concerned for the VIP program. So if any of you have any questions regarding the PowerPoint presentation, you can always email me, or you should have my email address on the email that I sent you that had your screening results and your corrective exercises. So if anybody has any questions, just send me an email or give me a call. We can talk further. So the agenda tonight, so I just want to kind of go over, what we will be covering. First thing I want to do is kind of go over the functional movement screen and why it's important, and the results of the functional movement screen as far as a breakdown of the athletes and how the athletes scored as a whole. And then we'll kind of go over the risk assessment that I did, which is looking at shoulder range of motion in lots of different ways. Also looking at hip rotation range of motion, and also rotator cuff strength and shoulder strength, and why that's important, and some sports medicine research to back up some of those values as well. Okay. Yep. So basically, you all went through the functional movement screen. So I just want to kind of go over what that entails. The first one is called a deep squat, and that's whenever you squat as low as you can. And I looked and see, you know, what type of movement you have through your spine, what type of movement you had through your ankles. That was the major thing that I was looking for, and your shoulders. The next one was the hurdle step, and that looked at hip range of motion and balance. How well can you balance on one foot? It also checked hip range of motion. If you had any rotational deficits or tightness through the hip, that would show up during the hurdle step. The inline lunge was similar, looked at balance in a little bit different way in a tandem stance, which is one foot in front of the other. And that also looked at ankle mobility. How are your ankles moving? Do you have any tightness in your ankles and your hip? Shoulder mobility was just basically a real rough assessment of your shoulder range of motion on both sides, your right and your left side. The active straight leg raise mostly looks at hamstring length. Are your hamstrings tight? And then trunk stability push-up looked at general upper body and core strength. And then the rotary stability test, which everybody loves, it's the toughest one to do. That looks at lots of different things. Mostly it looks at rotational core strength, and also kind of moving the body on a kind of unstable point, because you're just on one side and you're lifting that entire right or left side while you're balancing on just one side. So kind of looked at all those different things. So the score, the way the scores were is at a 0. The athlete got a 0 if they had pain with any of the movement. The athlete got a 1 if they had a lot of difficulty performing the movement correctly. Most of you got 2s where you did the movement correctly, but you had minor deficiencies. Some of you got 3s, especially on the range of motion, the hamstring length, and the shoulder mobility. A lot of you guys got 3s on that because you're really mobile through the shoulders and also your hamstrings, which was really nice to see. So basically, the functional movement screen captures a lot of different things. Basically, it captures the athlete's ability to perform fundamental movements. And those movements are basically movements of the limbs in space, and how do they move? Do you have any tightness through the joints? It also captures the athlete's motor control. Motor control means controlling the movement through space with balance and coordination. And it also captures the athlete's ability to perform basic movements uncomplicated by specific skills. So basically, this was some research that was done in 2016 in the Journal of Sports Medicine. And basically what it found, this was a systematic review with meta-analysis, which basically means they pulled in lots of different research and they combined all the data. So it was a pretty good research study because they pulled in a lot of different research studies and they compiled all the data, and this is what they came up with. And this was not just with baseball players, this was just with athletes in general. It could be handball, swimmers, it could be any type of athlete at all. So basically what they found is with participants with composite scores of less than or equal to 14 had a significant higher likelihood of an injury compared to those with higher scores, demonstrating the injury predictive value of the functional movement screen. So that's why we do the functional movement screen, just to capture how the athletes are moving. And then based on how they're moving, I'll be able to give them corrective exercises to help them move better in those patterns, which if you do the corrective exercises, your functional movement screen should improve And with that, when the functional movement screen improves, that just means that you have, better balance, coordination, better range of motion, and that just makes you overall more athletic. So here was a distribution of the functional movement screen. So 20% of you scored between 11 and 14. So, 20% of you really need to work hard on those. Well, all of you need to do the corrective exercises, but especially the 20% that scored 14 or below. 18% scored 15, 26% scored 16, 15% scored 17, 15% 18, 4% 19, and 3% 20. So, the 17 to 20 was actually really good. I think last year, the group that I did, the 17 to 20 group was around maybe 25%, and now we're looking at 37%. So, and a lot of those guys that scored in the higher were guys who had done the VIP program previously. So that tells me that either a couple things: either one, they're doing their corrective exercises and it's improving their overall athletic ability. And also, obviously, they're getting stronger and they're getting more coordinated with age. And so typically, as you get older, you typically score a little higher in the functional movement screen because you have more balance and coordination and strength and those types of things as you get, older into 15, 16, 17-year-olds. So was that the next one, Mike?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to kind of go over, that was the functional movement screen. Now I want to kind of go over the shoulder range of motion assessments I did and the reasons behind that. So this study was done in 2011. It's a little dated. It's 11 years old, but still very important research with this. It basically showed that pitchers who demonstrated a loss of greater than 20 degrees of internal rotation, that's rolling the shoulder down, that's internal rotation, compared to the non-throwing shoulder are at a 4 times higher risk for upper extremity injury. A study done in 2017 looking at the same metric of internal rotation, they kind of broke it down a little further, and it showed that pitchers who demonstrated a loss of 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 15 degrees, and 20 degrees in the throwing shoulder compared to the non-throwing shoulder resulted, again, in 1.3, 1.6, 2.1, and 2.7 times greater risk of shoulder or elbow injury, and that's respective to the loss. So 5 degrees loss, 1.3 times, 10 degrees, 1.6. So you can see as you have more and more loss of internal rotation, your risk of elbow and shoulder injuries are higher. That's why I set the benchmark of greater or equal to 20 degrees of internal rotation loss as a flag to say you needed to do some corrective exercises to get that internal rotation back up, because those two studies of 20 degrees and again 20 degrees put you at least almost a 3 times higher risk of injury. Okay. This looked at external rotation, and external rotation is, rolling the shoulder backwards. That's external. This is internal rotation, and this is external rotation. And what they found in 2015 was that pitchers who demonstrated an external rotation, actually an increase compared to a non-throwing shoulder, resulted in a 2 times greater risk of shoulder injury and a 4 times greater risk of shoulder surgery. Pitchers who demonstrated external rotation loss of the throwing shoulder compared to his non-throwing shoulder increases risk of shoulder injury by 7%. So that was done in 2017. So basically the top study here, pitchers who demonstrated external rotation increase of less than 5 degrees, it shows basically, a lot of times pitchers should have similar or more external rotation on that throwing side than their non-throwing side, because you're throwing with that shoulder and you're causing layback all the time, which kind of loosens that shoulder up. And it also changes some of the bony adaptations of your shoulder socket. And so that's why they showed that less than 5 degrees increase was a little bit more of a risk, because they showed some tightness in there. So the next study was in 2017, and it basically looked at total range of motion. Total range of motion is basically internal rotation measurement plus external rotation measurement. That's total range of motion. Total rotational motion loss of greater than 5 degrees in the throwing shoulder compared to the non-throwing shoulder resulted in almost a 3 times greater risk of elbow injury. So that total range of motion loss compared to both sides, there's something to that. And then pitchers who demonstrated a total range of motion loss of greater than 7 degrees are at a higher risk. So one study was done in 2017, the other one in 2019, but they're showing, between 5 and 7 degrees as something that you need to look for. The second study was actually pretty nice because it actually brought in high school kids, college and professional baseball pitchers. A lot of the other studies, unfortunately, are done with professional baseball players or college baseball players. That's just all the data we have so far. There really hasn't been a lot of sports medicine research done for high school age pitchers. So a lot of the data that I have to go by to develop these screenings have to come from these studies, because that's all that there is at this point. I know that they are trying to do some research with high school players because we are seeing, as a population, we're seeing that high school pitchers, the injury rate of high school pitchers have gone up substantially over the past 10 years. Mm-hmm. So they're really trying to get out some good research studies on high school pitchers because of that huge spike in injury in high school baseball pitchers.
Hey, Scott, quick question on that bottom study. We're talking about range of motion loss in the shoulder, but that also leads to higher injury risk of the UCL and the elbow.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is something going on in the shoulder affecting the elbow?
Well, the reason is because if you're, as a pitcher, you're gonna tell the shoulder to do certain things, right? I mean, the shoulder is gonna move, and if you don't have, if you have loss of motion at the shoulder joint, then that stress is going to it's going to be translated down the arm. Mm-hmm. And you're going to compensate because of that loss of motion in the shoulder. You're going to compensate at the elbow. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to put more stress through the elbow when you have these range of motion losses and deficits. And that's why it's so important to try to do your corrective exercises, your stretches. And that's also why arm care is so very, very important, especially, the day after you pitch. You really need to get on a solid arm care program, and understand that if you don't have a solid arm care program and don't do that arm care after every time you pitch, you're going to be at a much higher risk of injury, because you will lose motion, mm-hmm. And you'll probably lose strength in the rotator cuff as well. And that's another risk factor for injury too. So I can't stress arm care. if any of you guys don't know what I'm talking about, I'm sure, Mike can fill you in on an arm care program. I'm going to be making a reference to an arm care program at the end of this PowerPoint presentation for you guys to check out. But it's very important to get one established and to do it every time the day after you pitch. So the next thing I looked at was isolated shoulder flexion range of motion. And what isolated shoulder flexion means, shoulder flexion is just basically going up and over, reaching straight up and over your head. And when I have people lie down and I had them go up over their head, what happens is once you get to a certain part of elevation, the shoulder blade actually comes off the table. So now your shoulder blade rotates up a little bit with your arm. Isolated shoulder flexion basically means stabilizing that shoulder blade to the table and seeing how much motion you have without shoulder blade rotation. And that's isolated, because what we're looking at with that is how much motion do you have just in the ball and socket joint, because your shoulder joint is a ball and socket. My skeleton over here, I don't know if any of you guys know what a ball and socket joint is, but it's basically just a ball that the top of the arm rolls on the socket, and that's what your shoulder joint is. It's a ball and socket joint. So I was just interested in to see what that isolated flexion was without that shoulder blade movement. And the reason that is because, and actually I've heard some, the American Sports Medicine Institute, which is run by Dr. Andrews out of Birmingham, Alabama. And of course, Dr. Andrews, if you don't know who he is, he was the one that actually did the first Tommy John surgery. So he's very famous in the baseball world. And his institute, called the American Sports Medicine Institute, just a couple of weeks ago, they came out with a statement that basically said what they're finding is that shoulder flexion loss is as important, or maybe even more important, than rotational loss.
Wow.
And so that's really important. So pitchers who demonstrate, this was done in 2014 in the American Journal of Sports Medicine. And they found that pitchers who demonstrated a flexion loss of greater than 5 degrees are almost a 3 times higher risk for an elbow injury. And then another study was done in 2017 in the Journal of Arthroscopy that showed baseball pitchers who demonstrated flexion loss of the throwing shoulder compared to his non-throwing shoulder increases his risk of an elbow injury by 9% for each degree lost.
Wow. So
if you have a 5 degree loss, that puts your injury risk is at a 45% higher. So that's pretty significant when you start talking about each degree loss an increase by 9%. And that's why they're saying that, flexion loss might be more important than rotational loss at this point. That's kind of what the research is kind of pointing toward. So what did we find, or what did I find? 5% had total range of motion loss of greater than 5 degrees. 17 pitchers, or 15%, had a flexion loss of greater than 5 degrees. And 15 pitchers, 14% had loss of both flexion and total range of motion. So, I asked a lot of these guys, whenever I find these losses, I kind of ask them some questions. I say, like, what do you do for arm care? Or what is your arm care program? Or what do you do the day after you pitch? And a lot of these guys said, well, I do my band exercises. And they told me all about the band exercises they do. And I asked them, I said, well, what type of stretches do you do? So when I asked them what type of stretches they did, they went right to the band exercises because they didn't understand the difference between exercises and stretches. And so when I asked them about what type of stretching they're doing, a vast majority of them didn't know exactly what I was talking about. So that kind of goes into, that's probably obviously why they have that loss of motion. If they're not working on their mobility and getting that mobility back the day after they pitch, because those muscles get fatigued and they get sore and tired. And if you don't maintain their mobility, whenever they heal or whenever they recuperate, they kind of shorten a little bit. So you have to work to keep your arm loose. It's just not going to stay loose on its own. You have to work to keep it loose. So now we're going to look at external rotation strength, and that's basically just rolling out, see how much force you could apply externally into my dynamometer, which measures total amount of force that you're able to generate rolling your shoulder outwards. And the reason I looked at that is because this was actually done in the knee surgical sports trauma surgery, but they went ahead and even though it was the knee surgical sports surgery, it just doesn't mean they do knees. They kind of looked at lots of different things. And this was done out of Japan. And they kind of looked at a multifactorial analysis. So they basically kind of did what I did. They kind of did the functional movement screen. They looked at all the different parameters that I looked at. And what they found was that pitchers who demonstrated a decreases in external rotation strength ratio, and that's your throwing arm, external rotation strength, divided by your non-throwing arm, external rotation strength. So what they found is that the decreases in that ratio, if it was by 1.1, 0.2, 0.3, and 0.4, resulted in, again, these types of greater risks. And they were respective. So if you had a 0.1 difference, you were at a 1.6 times higher, 0.2, 2.7, 0.3, 4.4, and a 0.4 was almost, it was a 7 times greater risk of elbow or shoulder injury just from that loss of external rotation. So I want to kind of cover why external rotation strength is so important, because this is probably the most important area for strengthening when it comes to pitchers, because your external rotators cause your arm to roll back. So those muscles contract to set your arm back in the what's called the late cocking phase or the layback. Those muscles are the muscles that actually generate the force to roll your shoulder backwards. That's called external rotation. Then during follow through, those muscles have to be the brake or the decelerating. They have to decelerate that arm, because if your arm didn't decelerate, it would basically be pulled out of its socket, because your arm is traveling at such a high rate of speed that if the external rotators didn't do their job and put a brake on that, your arm would dislocate. And that's why external rotation strength is so important, because one, it pulls you back into layback, but two, it applies that brake, which if you didn't have that brake, you would have a labral tear. That's the danger of dislocating your shoulder or causing that distractive force through that shoulder without strong external rotators, is that it pulls on the shoulder joint and it can cause a labral tear. Also, the external rotators, it does those things, but it also, the external rotators basically compress the ball into the socket They're the compressive force that keeps the ball centered on the socket, so your shoulder moves the way it should. So if your external rotators are weak, you can see where it would cause a lot of problems, not only in the biomechanics of how your shoulder moves, but also during the follow-through phase, it could cause a rotator cuff tear or even a labral tear. So that's why it's so important to strengthen those external rotators. This study was done in 2017, and this was actually done, I think this is the same study actually, and it was for high school pitchers, which was really good. And again, this was out of Japan, which was really, really cool. So they looked at high school baseball pitchers, and what they found also in that study was that pitchers who demonstrated the throwing arm external rotation strength to internal rotation strength ratio. So you take your throwing arm external rotation strength and then divide that by your throwing arm's internal rotation strength. And what they found is that if that strength ratio is greater than 75%, that you're at a higher risk of shoulder and or elbow injury. So again, it's about that external rotation strength ratio, and that they just kind of looked at it a little bit different way. So what did we find? What did I find? Actually, it was pretty alarming to me. All the pitchers had some form of external rotation strength deficit, which was surprising. And the reason that happened this year instead of the years previously is because I changed the screening a little bit this past year due to some of that new research that I found in the literature. And so I looked at external rotation strength in like 4 different ways, whereas previously I was only looking at it in 1 or 2 different ways. So this year I looked at external rotation strength compared to body weight. And I also looked at external rotation strength, I believe it was with deltoid and scaption too. So lots of different ways to evaluate external rotation strength deficits instead of just 1 or 2 ways. I evaluated it in 4 different ways. So I think it captured a lot more of you guys into that. So I think it's, again, that's why I think, external rotation strength is very important. And I think all of you could benefit from doing those exercises.
And Scott, I know toward the end, we're going to make some recommendations where we kind of address this, right?
Yeah.
So I'll jump in too and talk about some of the changes that we're going to make to the training based on these numbers right here. This is alarming, and it's good that we know it. So.
Yep. 35%. Oh, sorry, Mike, go back.
Yep.
35% had internal rotation strength deficits. 35% had lower trapezius strength. Now, the lower trapezius and the middle trapezius, they are scapular stabilizers. They help stabilize the shoulder blade. So, basically, your socket's in the shoulder blade, and then your arm bone rolls on that socket. So the best way to think about scapular stability and the lower and middle trapezius is that if your shoulder blade is moving and kind of unstable, if those muscles are weak and your shoulder blade's moving and your arm is also trying to move on that shoulder blade too, you can see where the whole mechanics is going to be screwed up and how your arm moves. You need a stable foundation. You need a stable socket in order for your arm to move on that ball, to move on that socket without the socket moving and the arm moving at the same time. And that's why I checked lower and middle trapezius strength. And, 35% basically had, lower or middle trapezius strength deficits. And I gave you some corrective exercises to do with that. The supraspinatus is a rotator. It's one of the muscles of the rotator cuff. And the deltoid obviously is the big muscle out here in the shoulder. That's the deltoid. And so I checked that as well, because there's been some data to come out to say that's an important metric to look at too. I can understand the supraspinatus because that's part of the rotator cuff complex. And we want to make sure that we have strong rotator cuff muscles. And then the deltoid obviously plays a role in your overall force generation through the shoulder. So 61% of the pitchers had some strength deficits in their supraspinatus or their deltoid strength deficit. And I'm sure that's something that you guys will be covering in your strengthening program. So stance and stride hip rotation. I just threw some pictures up here of some Major League Baseball pitchers. You can see how much rotation they have in the stance and the stride hip. The stance and the stride hip, your hips have to be mobile, especially rotationally. If you don't have rotation through, if you don't have good rotation through the hips, that's going to hinder your ability to transmit that force, that ground force that you're creating through your lower half. You're going to leak a lot of velocity through your hips if you don't have good hip rotation. So we want to make sure your hips are loose so you can generate that force through your lower half and get it transmitted to the ball. So this is some information on the external and internal rotation deficits that was done. And this research was actually in 21, which was really nice to see. And it was done in the International Journal of Sports Medicine. And what they found basically in this study was that stance hip, external rotation, external rotation is where if you stand up and rotate your whole leg outward, or you point your toes, you rotate so your toes are pointed out, that's external rotation. And then internal rotation is basically rolling your whole hip internally, so your toes are pointing in. So what they found was stance hip external rotation deficits. And biomechanically, if you have a deficit in external rotation in your stance hip, this will prevent the pelvis from opening fully during the late cocking and will restrict the forward movement of the pitcher's trunk over the stride leg. This decreases the force transfer from the lower half, which reduces ball velocity, and places more stress through the throwing shoulder and elbow due to the over-reliance on the arm to produce the force and velocity and not the lower half. And I know that's something Mike talks about a lot with his pitching mechanics and stuff like that. You've got to use your lower half. And in order to use your lower half properly, you have to have good external rotation through that stance hip. What they found, the stride hip, is that if you have an internal rotation through a deficit through the stride hip, it significantly is associated with an increased risk for shoulder and elbow injury due to the decreased elbow flexion angle at the point of ball release. So I found that very interesting, where, if you have a rotational deficit through the hip, that's going to influence your motion at the elbow. And I know everybody has heard about this before, but it's called the kinetic chain. So, it starts at your foot and it goes, through your leg, your hip, your core, your shoulder, your elbow, and then to the ball. And that's the kinetic chain. And if you have anything going on in any of those areas, it's going to reduce your performance. And that's why the kinetic, looking at the whole kinetic chain is so important.
So just a quick comment from the coaching side, right? If we are coaching a movement in a drill, but that athlete has a rotational deficit in their stance or stride hip, it's going to be really hard to make that movement change because of that deficit, right?
Yeah.
So what we'll find is pitchers will work really hard on doing a drill or moving down the mound better, right? But they forget about the corrective exercises where this was identified, where that is going to help them move better, right?
Right.
If you improve that rotational deficit,
yeah, right.
your throw mechanics improve and you move better down the mound. And so
yeah.
just a reminder that it's so important to continue to do those corrective exercises throughout this program.
Yeah. So, that's a good point. So, the thing is that, not only with pitchers, but I also work with other, athletes who are injured or who have tightness or something like that. And I ask them to do a movement and they can't do it. And I can keep asking them to try to do the movement. It's going to be the same thing over and over and over until we correct why they can't do the movement. I mean, if you can't do a movement because you have tightness, then doing more of that movement is not going to make it better.
Right.
You have to figure out why you can't move in that way and then make corrections to whatever's going on, and then try that movement again once those corrections have been achieved, and then you're going to be able to do the movement. Does that kind of make sense? So, and so that's a lot of times people are putting the cart before the horse. Well, you have to be able to move properly in certain ways before you can move athletically, I guess is the way is kind of what I'm talking about.
And I think it goes back to the idea that we just don't have a facility with lanes to throw.
Right.
There's strength coaches in a weight room because it all links together and it's all very, very, very important.
Yep. This was done in 2020, which was pretty cool. This was in the Journal of Shoulder and Elbow Surgery. And this was also done in Japan. And what they found in this study was that a decreased lead hip, which would be your stride hip. So decreased stride hip internal rotation was significantly associated with an increased risk for shoulder and elbow pathology in 9 to 12-year-old pitching cohort or 9 to 12-year-old pitching group. That's a cohort means group. So in the 9 to 12-year-olds, just like the previous slide, they talk about the stride hip internal rotation loss and how that is associated with injury. And what they found in this study in 2020 was, again, stride hip internal rotation loss. They found that happened again for shoulder and elbow pathology in 9 to 12-year-olds. So, it goes all the way up from 9-year-olds all the way up. So that's why hip rotation is important. This study was done in 2015. It's basically a review. It was orthopedic reviews in the journal. And again, I think this was also, this was in China or Japan. And so again, hip internal and total rotational deficits. There's a correlation between hip internal rotation and total rotation deficits and hip, hamstring, and groin injuries in catchers and pitchers. So not only are you going to have an increased risk of elbow and shoulder injury, you're also going to have an increased risk of hip, hamstring, and groin injuries as well with that total rotational deficit. So I found that 32%, a third of the pitchers that I evaluated had hip internal and or external rotation tightness in either their stance or stride hip. So 32% of you had some type of tightness in your hips, whether that be internal or external rotation. And that's why I gave you corrective exercises for the external rotation tightness. And I think that hip tightness was addressed in the deep squat correctional exercises with the bretzel stretch and some other things that we talked about in that video for the hip rotation stretches. Okay, so my conclusions were, so far I've assessed 110 pitchers, and I think I have 4 or 5 left, and that's going to be done this Saturday. But so far, I've evaluated 110 pitchers, and what I found overall was that the lower functional movement scores were performed by younger or first-time VIP pitchers. So for those guys that are new to the program, you've never been through the functional movement screen before, you've never been given corrective exercises to work on your movement deficits, you probably scored a little bit lower than the guys who have been working on these things for the past couple of years. You know, the research and the statistics show that the younger you are, you know, the less coordinated you are, basically, because you're still trying to grow into your body. And so just do those corrective exercises. I think that's really going to help you overall. It's going to help you become a better athlete in general. 35% of the pitchers that I evaluated had either flexion, internal, external rotation, or total range of motion loss. So a third of you had some type of shoulder mobility loss, which puts you at a higher risk for elbow or shoulder injury. So basically what that tells me is that you must continue to stretch and maintain shoulder mobility. And I know we all like to do exercises. We all like to do our band exercises and things like that. But I'm here to tell you that stretching is probably, you know, mobility, in my opinion, is probably more of a risk factor than strength deficits when it comes to shoulder. Because if the shoulder tightens up and gets tight, it's going to put more stress through the elbow. And also overall, you're just going to be moving tissues and connective tissues that are tight, and eventually they're just going to fail. All the pitchers I evaluated had some kind of external rotation strength deficits. And that was a mix of obviously both VIP veterans and first timers. So you have to continue to perform your arm care exercises. That's very important. A third of you had either hip internal or external rotation deficits. So again, to stress the point, in order to efficiently transfer force generated from your lower half to the baseball, which is velocity, and minimize your injury risk, your hips must be flexible. You have to have flexible hips with rotation.
All right, thanks, Scott. I think everybody's muted. I'm going to give you a round of applause for that that info. But I would like to connect some dots with a few things on this conclusions page, and kind of talk through, you know, with the athletes and parents on, you know, what do we do? And so feel free to jump in here when we talk about how do we move forward with some of these things. So number one, we are going to make some changes with the program and what we're doing, including adding the Throwers 10 program as just a part of what all the athletes do each day, in addition to doing more hip mobility as part of the warm-up. So we are going to make some changes on the floor during training, but that's only a small picture of the entire week. And so we need to make sure that we're doing these things on a consistent basis. So the movement screen report, any deficit any athlete has is listed in there, along with the corrective exercises to complete. Those need to be done on a consistent basis throughout the program, starting now, hopefully started before, but definitely now. And as we head into December, when we start ramping up the throwing intensity and volume, you know, this is where we want to have this covered and these routines definitely ready, so that we can minimize the risk of injury. I said to every athlete, the number one goal of this program is to have you be healthy at the end of it, so you're ready to go compete. The number 2 goal is that we throw harder, and number 3 goal is we have better command or better off speed pitch. But we can't do 2 and 3 if number 1 fails, right? If you're hurt, you can't get better at all. And so, Glenn talks about this. He'll mention this a lot. If you don't do the things that you've been told, you're going to learn from a sling. And he's right. And Glenn went through that, and he had elbow surgery in college. And so, he's speaking from experience there. So every athlete has the information there and the program there. We have to do it. And so don't think that because we didn't get to it in 2 hours and 15 minutes doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing your stretches and your recovery, right? It's so important. So that's just a huge push on my end, is that you have the information. What we do with it is key. We have to do these things. We have to be attentive to the detail. And it's boring. It's boring. It is. And we talk about recovery and warm-up is boring. Throwing hard is fun. But in order to do the fun stuff, we got to do the boring stuff. So that's my big push as the pitching coordinator of this program, is that we need to do these things. We do not want to learn from a sling and then later say, oh, I wish I would have done the things that Scott Bailey and Coach Grady and Glenn told me to do. Thoughts on that, Scott?
Yeah, exactly. And I agree with everything Mike said. Also, what was interesting is that some of the guys that are VIP athletes actually had the same range of motion deficits that they had last year at this time. And so, what's important for guys to understand is that if you are, everybody's arm reacts differently to stress, okay? Because we're all different. And if you're a pitcher who loses flexion after you pitch, some guys lose flexion, some guys lose internal rotation, some guys lose both. It just all depends on who you are and how your body adapts and how you respond, how your shoulder responds to stress. So if you were a guy who I evaluated last year and maybe even the year before that, and every time I evaluate you, you have the exact same range of motion loss, and the only reason that can be is because you probably did your stretches and then you attained full range of motion and then you stopped doing them. So what I told those guys is that as long as you throw a baseball with intent, then you're going to need to continue doing those stretches. That should be something that, because your arm responds in that way. And if you stop doing those stretches, then your arm is going to revert back to where it was before, because that's how you respond. That's how your arm responds to stress. Some guys can get away with doing no stretches at all and have full range of motion and no deficits. Okay. Some guys can't. But if you're one of the guys who have to stretch to maintain their mobility after you pitch, then just realize that that's something that you're going to have to keep doing, because that's how your arm responds to stress. And so, Mike, did you have that last slide with the thrower's 10? I sent you the second, the revised PowerPoint. Did you have the other one that I sent you? I sent you two.
Let me pull that up here real quick.
Okay.
And,
yeah.
If you sent it to me, I have it. Yep, I got it here. So let me just pull it up and then share the screen again.
Yeah, let me just go to the last. I think everything was covered except the last slide.
Okay.
Okay. So my recommendations, based on everything I found, okay? So based on the current sports medicine research regarding baseball pitcher arm health and risk of injury, external rotation strength is very important. The Throwers 10 exercise program focuses on strengthening the external rotation, the rotator cuff, and the scapular muscles. That would be the middle and lower trapezius. The Throwers 10 exercise program was actually developed by the American Sports Medicine Institute, or again, that institute that was founded and is run by Dr. James Andrews. And so these are I think it's actually 12 exercises, but these are the 12 things that he thinks, and also what the current sports medicine research shows to be probably, if you're going to do any type of exercises, these are the ones you should be doing, especially if you're a baseball pitcher. So there's a link. There's the link to the YouTube video that has the Throwers 10 exercises, and it's a pretty nice video. It kind of goes over each exercise, and it shows a guy doing the exercise, and then it has Dr. Kevin Wilk, who is a physical therapist who works with Dr. Andrews. He kind of narrates the whole thing and kind of explains, what you're doing and what muscles you're using and why it's important. So it's a pretty cool video to watch. And it's got some really, really nice things to do for arm health.
Awesome. So we are approaching an hour, and the information that we heard is just so important. So, this is not information that we are getting with our sports teams. It's not information we're getting at school, maybe in a college course, right, Scott? You get in this?
Yeah. I mean, my son plays at a Division I college. He's a pitcher, and he goes through a preseason screening, kind of like what I do. And so, some of the things he does, some of the things he gets, some of the things he doesn't get. So, just realize that, the things, basically what this is this is basically like a Major League Baseball combine. So every Major League Baseball player goes through something similar to what you guys had for your pre-screening. And a lot of times, even college baseball players don't get this type of screening. So I think it's very good. It's based on the current, the best current sports medicine research that's out there. And so take advantage of it. And if you guys have any questions regarding anything about your movement screen, any of the exercises, anything I covered tonight during this presentation, again, just give me a call or send me an email.
Yeah, so the rest of the items on the agenda, I'm going to have a meeting next week to cover that, because we're at an hour, and it's just awesome that we got to do this tonight. So I'm so glad we got to dedicate this time. We're also going to be talking with the athletes, prior to each class in the upcoming week about how they're managing the throwing program and how they are doing with their corrective exercises. And so every athlete on this call tonight, or listen to this on a recorded call, should be opening up the movement screen and doing those corrective exercises. All the instructions are there. Please ask questions, parents and athletes, athletes on the floor. Sometimes we get a little nervous when we don't get questions, because if you're a freshman, I know sometimes it might be intimidating to ask, but we get a little worried when you're not, because we're not sure if you're quite understanding exactly what you should be doing. So please ask questions. We are here to help. That being said, if anybody wants to unmute and ask questions now, we'd be happy to go over some question and answer period. If you're good and want to sign off, that's great. But we're going to kind of hang around here for a few minutes to answer questions. And if not, we will see everybody on the floors back tomorrow. So we'll just kind of If you want to ask a question, unmute yourself and we'll hang out for a few minutes. If you even want to put a question in the chat box, that would be fine too. I will see that as well.
Yeah, on off days when they go through these exercises, what amount of time should they be dedicating to these stretches and these exercises?
Good question. So I'm just going to kind of say what the current literature says, that if you want to maintain and gain mobility in the shoulder, your stretches should be held for 30 seconds, and they should be done 3 times in a row. So you'll perform your stretch. It should not be painful, but you should perform the stretch and hold it for a good 30-second count. And that's like a 30-second count based on a clock and not, counting. And then after the first set of 30 seconds, you kind of wait 15 seconds or so, and then you apply it again for 30 seconds. And then you rest for 15, and then you apply it again for 30 seconds. So that's basically stretching to maintain and gain mobility. If you're just stretching to kind of, get the blood flow going and stuff like that, you can just hold a stretch for maybe 5 seconds, because you're not trying to gain mobility or maintain it at that point. You're just trying to kind of get the muscles, and the tendons loose and warmed up, which is a different type of stretching. So does that answer your question?
My comment to that, Scott, and I think the athletes would say that is a long time. Like that's a lot longer than what they're.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
They would say it feels like forever. So that's a great thing. Like put the clock on and hold it for that long. That's forever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the minimum.
Yeah.
That's 30 seconds is the minimum amount of time for 3 times in a row. And that should be done daily. Especially if you have a loss. Now, if you have a loss of motion, that should be done daily. But if you don't have a loss of motion, you should do that, the day after you pitch. You shouldn't do it the day of, immediately after you pitch. That's a time for you to recover. But the day after you pitch, you should be doing some foam rolling over the upper back and around the shoulder blade to kind of get the muscles warmed up and loose. Maybe even do some of the light throwers 10 exercises to get the blood flow going to the muscles. And then after that, you're just going right into that nice, easy, comfortable stretch to maintain that mobility in the shoulder.
And I think one of the things we're going to talk to our athletes about is the day after throwing, it might say off in the manual, but that's just off from throwing a baseball. It's
absolutely
not off from stretching.
Right.
It's not off from foam rolling.
Right.
It's not off from working on your tissue quality. And so that's a big thing that I want to communicate with our athletes about this.
Mike, I'm glad you said that because he says to me, it's off, Dad. Yeah. So as a freshman and a new person to the program, I think that's kind of important to refresh with the kids.
Yeah. And it just kind of came to me that like we are going to redefine what off actually means. It means no throwing. It doesn't mean not doing your daily correctives or your daily stretching. And I know, like, especially as a freshman, like I feel like freshmen are like all of a sudden like a senior level class. Like what is going on? This is all new, and it does take some time, and that's okay, and we'll get there with them, with all of our athletes. But as a parent, you might be noticing that, which is okay.
I have a quick question on days where you are doing some throwing, and a lot of times it seems like they want to just jump in and do band work. you said that this could be in place of band work, or it's more important than band work. So on those days where they're going to do some throwing, should they do this and band work, or just do this? What are your thoughts, like with including band work?
Oh, okay. So you're talking about before they hit the mound?
Yes.
Okay.
Just for a throwing day.
Yeah. Between, so before, yeah. So the day, the day that they're going to be pitching, I would not recommend doing static stretching.
We're unmuted, so.
Yeah. I would not recommend doing static stretching 3 times 30 seconds before they pitch. Okay. That's not the time to do that. Before you pitch, what I recommend is basically just getting your body warm, getting it hot, run, just kind of get warmed up. And that could be anything from doing very, very light, band work. And then you basically just kind of doing some active range of motion quickly through the shoulder, maybe even doing just some quick, 5-second stretches. But prior to pitching, is not the time to work on mobility. It's a time to prepare the body to be active. And so that's what I would recommend. The time to do these, the time to stretch is the day after you pitch. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it just seems like, is any of this stretching done? So no stretching when they're throwing, and band work, still maintain the band work.
So
absolutely. Yeah.
So every athlete this week experience what a full dynamic warm-up looks like before throwing. And they're going to do that every single time they're on the floor. And that includes a dynamic warm-up where they're going to run. They're going to do, like arm circles. And so they're going to warm up the shoulder joint and the hip socket. They're going to do their band work, which is lighter band work. They're going to do plyos and shoulder tube, wrist weights, and then they throw baseball. And so that'll be ingrained in them. So the stretching and the holds for 30 seconds, that's more post throwing of the day after. Andrew, do you have a question?
Actually, Dad does, Mike.
Hi, John. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. Mike, Scott, thank you for this. It's been very informative. But as Scott, you were explaining, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, as you were explaining these stretches, hold for 30 seconds, 3 times each. I'm asking Andrew what stretches. I get the corrective exercises, but that's not, those aren't the stretches. So my question is, what stretches are you referring to? Like, is it just, Mike, is it just what you do on Tuesdays and Saturdays before the session, or what stretches should he be holding for 30 seconds and doing 3 times? I'm not clear about.
I got you. So if he had no range of motion loss, if he did not have a loss of motion and deflection, or if he did not have a total range of motion loss or an internal rotation loss, then he did not get stretches to do.
Oh,
so, because he doesn't have any, he does not have to work on gaining mobility because of tightness through the shoulder. So only those pitchers that had those loss of motion deficits in their shoulder were given those stretches to do for that 30-second hold.
So that's going to be found in the report that you sent, Scott, to each athlete after they came in from the functional movement screen.
Okay, Mike. So I'm going to have to apologize to my son.
No.
You know how, because he's like, I didn't get stretches. So my last question, follow up to that. Is there any benefit to do some of these stretches, Scott, Mike, from a preventative standpoint, and if so, how would I find, what stretches might you suggest?
Yeah, probably the best, if he doesn't have any if he doesn't have any loss of motion deficits, then I would probably suggest that the one stretch that he do after he pitches the day after would be the sleeper stretch.
Okay.
And the sleeper stretch, that you can just go on, YouTube and type in sleeper stretch. It's
okay.
You basically lie on your side, on your throwing side, and bring your arm out to the side, and then you're just basically rolling your arm down into internal rotation to stretch those external rotators that were just put through a beating the day of pitching. That would probably be the one thing I would have him do, would be the sleeper stretch into internal rotation.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks, John. All right. If there are any more questions, shoot us an email. We'll get back to you, and plan on an email about next week. We'll cover this and how we're going to add some of these things we talked about tonight to the throwing program. But thank everybody for joining us. Scott, thank you for this information. This was awesome. I felt like I took my notes here, and I was in class for a while, and I feel like this is really going to help us make some changes on the floor with our athletes, and then we are going to ask our athletes to make sure they're doing what they need to be doing off the floor on the other days they're not here. So
yeah, right.
Anyway, thank you, Scott. I'm going to go ahead and stop the share, but
all right,
we'll be in touch.
All right, thanks everybody.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.